So good morning, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of our series on John of the Cross. I will probably still have some folks trickling in as we get started, but I just want to take this moment to welcome all of you back, if you were here with us last week, to our session. This is sponsored by Mary Magdalene Apostle Catholic Community based out of San Diego, California, on the land the Kumeyaay people have tended for generations. And we're grateful that you're here with us, joining us for this session. As a reminder, this session, as well as the first one, will be recorded. So you can, if you miss them, if you miss the beginning, you can catch them afterwards. They'll be on our website, mmacc.org, as well as on our Facebook. We'd like to extend a thank you to Contemplative Outreach of San Diego, Contemplative Outreach of North San Diego, and the Spiritual Directors Association of San Diego. Also, a thank you goes to Diane Langworthy for helping organize this event, Linda Hill Phoenix for providing our harp music, and of course, Oliva Espin, who will be leading us in our workshop presentation today. Oliva Espin is Professor Emerita of Women's Studies at San Diego State University and served the institution from 1990 to 2007. As a native of Cuba, Espin received her bachelor's degree from the University of Costa Rica in 1969, her doctoral degree from the University of Florida in 1974. In addition to her many years of teaching experience, her research and advocacy is also laudable. She's fought for refugee women to gain access to mental health care services, and her articles, book chapters, and books are interdisciplinary in nature, tying in psychology, social justice issues, politics, and religion to raise questions about gender, sexuality, language, and race barriers. Her presentations in the US and the world at large are just as exciting as her classroom lectures. She's been a pioneer in introducing intersectional perspectives into feminist psychology. And among her other books, she recently completed Women's Statehood and Power, A Feminist Psychology of Cultural Constructions, and a link to that is available on our website if you'd like to check that out. And her memoir will be published this October. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Oliva because we have much to cover today.
Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all here. And we have a lot to cover today, as Corey said. So I'm going to go to the PowerPoint. Instead of having notes that made me keep looking down last time, everything is going to be in the PowerPoint. So I am not going to say every single word that it's in the PowerPoint, but that's what it's going to guide us. Okay, so without further ado, okay, just put this up here. And slideshow from current slide. Okay. Okay. So you will hear my voice, but mostly this is what you would have in your screen. Okay. So as I said last time, John has 3 main poems. He has many, many, many more, but his 3 main poems that he wrote commentary about are the Spiritual Canticle that we used last time several times, then the Dark Night poem, or One Dark Night, and the Living Flame of Love, and we are going to talk about those 2 today. He has 4 treatises in prose in which he's trying to explain the poetry. And remember what I read last time, he said, there's no way to explain poetry. And we know that, and much less when the poetry is written in another language. So his 4 prose treatises are the Ascent of Mount Carmel, the Dark Night, the Spiritual Canticle, and the Living Flame of God, of Love. The first 2 focus on the Dark Night poem. The other 2 refer each to the respective poem by that title. So Ascent of Mount Carmel and Dark Night are both based on the Dark Night poem. These 2 books are like 2 versions of the same ideas. And this poem, the One Dark Night poem, is actually describing what happens after or as a consequence of the dark nights. John left both books unfinished. He finished both books very abruptly. It's like he got bored with them, or he had other things to do, or whatever it may have been. But the basic theory is right there. Let me start by talking about what dark night is not, because the concept is used all the time, and most of the time, people don't know what they're talking about in terms of what John said. So the dark night is not having a hard time in life, suffering, illness, midlife crisis, or an economic reversal, or any other kind of human difficulty. Dark night is not mental illness, psychological illness. Dark night is not depression. It may produce these feelings, but it is not that. Dark night is a process of purification of the soul as the soul progressively moves towards union with God. So it is a spiritual process, partly facilitated by our desire for union with God, and partly done by God in us without our intervention. And as I said, there may be hard times that come, and I'm going to be talking about that, out of the dark nights, but it is not having a hard time in life. You know, people are having suffering, and a friend says, "Oh, you are in the dark night of the soul." No, you're having a hard time. You're not in the dark night of the soul. So we need to have that very clear, what John means by talking about dark nights. So what happens in the process of dark nights is that it's an emptying of the person to create space for God in the soul. John talks about the caverns of the soul. And in this process of the dark night, we increase our knowledge of God and our self-knowledge. There's first the night of the senses, and it's active and passive. Active is what we do, passive is what God does for us. And then there's a night of the spirit, in which there's a part we do and a part that God does. It is a very painful process, because the soul, remember that for John, the soul is the person. And by the way, parentheses, the word person in Spanish is feminine. We talk about, grammatical gender is arbitrary and has nothing to do with reality. In Spanish, person is la persona, and all the adjectives that go to person are feminine adjectives. Neither here nor there. Again, just a little piece of information for those who don't speak Spanish. Anyway, the soul is the person. So the soul, the person, feels abandoned by God during the nights. But, says John, God is more present than ever and acting in the soul. And the metaphor he uses is that the blind, bright light of God, it's so intense that the soul cannot look at it. But because that bright light is focused on your soul, what you see is the darkness in yourself that the light of God illuminates. That's why we feel that all these bad things that are happening to us, when in reality, it's a moment where God is working in us actively. So God creates the night or the nights and does the work. The soul is mostly passive. The only thing the soul does actively to prepare itself encounter with God. And it does that by mortifying desire, sensual pleasures. You know, the word mortification is not something we like, but that's what it says. We actively prepare for this by desiring God and being willing in the total darkness of faith that informs our understanding. Remember that for John and for people in his time, the soul has three faculties: understanding, memory, and will. And understanding is the intellect. And so we're willing to live in the total darkness of faith to inform our understanding, and we're willing to empty our memory and our imagination and even our identity, and just want to love willingly, even though we don't have much of an idea of what is really happening inside us at that moment. And when I say letting go of your identity, we're talking about be willing to let go of our roles. And am I this type of, in the Myers-Briggs, or am I this number in the Enneagram, or I am this or I am that? To be willing to let go of that and not know who you are, to let God show you who you really are. So the One Dark Night poem, as I said, describe what happens through the dark nights and finds itself at the other side of the process, united with God after having undergone this painful cleansing. So here is the poem. And John titled it Songs of the Soul that Rejoices in High State of Perfection, which is union with God by the path of spiritual negation. So he didn't title the poem Night. This is what the Songs of the Soul that Rejoices, etc., is what he says about the poem. So let me do as I did last time, read it to you first in Spanish so you can hear the rhythm, and then go to the translation of the poem, which of course doesn't capture all these small emotion. Okay. En una noche oscura, con ansias en amores inflamada, oh dichosa aventura, salí sin ser notada, estando ya mi casa sosegada. A oscuras y segura por la secreta escala disfrazada, oh dichosa aventura, a oscuras y encelada, estando ya mi casa sosegada. En la noche dichosa, en secreto, que nadie me veía ni yo miraba cosa, sin otra luz seguía, sino la que en el corazón ardía. Aquesta me guiaba más cierto que la luz del mediodía, a donde me esperaba quien yo bien sabía, en parte donde nadie parecía. Oh noche que guiaste, oh noche amable más que la luna, oh noche que juntaste con amada, amada en el amado transformada. En mi pecho florida, artero para se guardaba, allí quedó dormida, y yo le regalaba, y el ventalleros aire daba. El aire de la almena, cuando yo sus cabellos esparcía, con su mano serena en mi cuello hería, y todos mis sentidos suspendía. Quedéme y olvidéme. El rostro recliné sobre el amado. Cesó todo y dejéme, dejándome cuidado entre las azucenas, olvidado. One dark night, fired with love, urgent longings, the sheer grace, I went out unseen, my house being now all stilled. in darkness and secure by the secret ladder disguised the sheer grace in darkness and concealment, my house being now all stilled. Oh, that glad night in secret, for no one saw me, nor did I look at anything with no other light of guide than the one that burned in my heart. This guided me, more sure than the light of noon, to where he was waiting for me, him who I knew so well. There is a place where no one appeared. O guiding light, O night more lovely than the dawn, O night that has united the lover with his beloved, transforming the beloved in her lover. Upon my flowering breast, which I kept holding for him alone, there he lay sleeping, and I caressing him, there in a breeze from the fanning cedars. When the breeze blew from the turret, as I parted his hair, it wounded my neck with his gentle hand, suspending all my senses. I abandoned and forgot myself, laying my face on my beloved. All things ceased. I let go, leaving my cares forgotten among the lilies. And again, in this poem, as in the spiritual canticle, we can see the erotic feelings that John is describing. So let's stay with the poem for a moment. Corey, the PowerPoint is stuck again. Huh. Okay.
Can you try starting it again?
Okay. 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 Thank you. Okay, so this is a painting by John of Mount Carmel from 1649. And of course, we cannot read anything. It's terribly confusing. But it's so you see what his going up Mount Carmel is for him with all the details. Here's the same thing, this time in Spanish. So it's sort of a skeleton of what he said. And now here is the same thing in English. And we have, if you look at what my left side, we can go up spiritually, or we can go up, you know, with material things, but neither of these things lead us to God. The only thing that leads us to God is the center piece, in which the path to Mount Carmel is nothing, 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 and at the top of the mountain, nothing. Okay, this is a simplified version of what John is saying. Mount Carmel, ascending Mount Carmel is ascending the Mount of Perfection. Okay, so we can go or try to go to God by way of earthly goods. It doesn't take us there much because we get entangled in the earthly goods. Or we can go by the way of heavenly goods. And we're going to talk about a little bit more in a moment about that, because what he says in John's words, it's very unlikely that people who are trying to be united with God would feel that, or would be so tempted by the things of the world. Not that they cannot be, but they're less. The big temptation for people who really want to get to God is to use the way of spiritual goods and get entangled in them. But neither of these works. The narrow way of the perfect spirit is to stay there in nothing, waiting for God to do God's work. This is another way of looking at it. The base of the valley, the mountain, and what happens along the way that has to do with traditional ways of talking about prayer, the purgative way, the illuminative way, and the unitive way, which is the places where beginners, proficients, and perfects are. And we'll go through all that in a moment. So it gives you a sense of what he has in mind in terms of we're climbing something. So we are making an effort, but in reality, a lot of our effort is to wait for God. This is another version of this, but now what he's saying is the beginners are here, then there's the night of sense, passive or active. So beginners may get into the active and then it gets passive. Then the proficients, and then there's the night of the spirit, and then the perfect, which is the moment of real contemplation and union with God. This is a different version. John's Mount Carmel is a different version of the same thing that Teresa is saying in the interior castle. It's the process by which you become progressively cleaned to get to real contemplation and union with God. Okay, so who are beginners for John? Beginners are not real beginners. Remember who he's talking to. He's talking mostly to Carmelite nuns and friars. And the Carmelite rule requires 2 hours of solitary prayer each day, in addition to pondering God's law day and night and keeping watch at prayers, unless attending to some other duty. So someone who's already doing this on their daily life is not so much of a beginner in the way in which we understand beginners. It's someone who is already devoted to God and wanting to get to union with God. Even the lay people, mostly women, that John is addressing were similarly committed to prayer and meditation and contemplation, even though they may not have the Carmelite rule of 2 hours of solitary prayer each day, plus the choir prayer, plus praying, pondering the law of God day and night, regardless of what you're doing. Even so, these are people who are really interested in going to God, which is why they chose John as their spiritual director. So clearly, they're really devoted to this. They're not beginners in the way in which we understand it. Beginners, however, according to John, can fall by capital sins. And these capital sins, the way he looks them as dangerous, are spiritual manifestation of capital sins. So remember what I said earlier, that it's very easy to think of going up the way of heavenly goods. And if we are too fixed in the heavenly goods, this is how you get. So he says, and I think this is very relevant today. Okay. There's the danger of spiritual pride. We get attached to our devotions and become critical of others who are not as devout as we are, or not as devout as they should be. We sort of know that if everybody were as saintly as we are, everything would be perfect. Then there's spiritual avarice, which is collecting religious objects, books, forms of prayer, prayer workshops and retreats. The modern commentators said, we may not be so interested in having statues of saints around us or rosaries or whatever religious object during John's time, but we are very much wanting to collect prayer workshops and techniques and books and, that kind of thing. So again, it means be careful with all these things because they're good things, but they can lead to distraction. Spiritual lust has to do with attachments to the pleasure of spiritual activity that sometimes can include physical pleasure. Some of the commentators talk about being sometimes even aroused sexually when you're praying. But John is not talking so much about that as to this lust of the pleasure of being with God and being inspired and these beautiful words and this and that. And so you're attached to the pleasure that produces. Spiritual envy, being envious of others' spiritual growth, being unhappy that other people are saintlier than we are. Spiritual sloth, desire to dwell in consolations, doing what we want without following directions of anybody. What I want to do is be happy here and nobody has to tell me that I need to sacrifice anything. Spiritual gluttony has to do with doing more penance than anyone, feeling pleasure in excessive mortification or in excessive penances again. And, you know, I don't think in our modern age, we are so preoccupied with penances as people were in John's time about physical self-torture in order to get to God. But still, something that can be true then and true now is that when people, and this is something John says very actively, when people do too much penance beyond what is reasonable, what their spiritual director suggests, what happens is that leads to the sin of pride. See how prayerful I am. See how good I am at self-sacrifice. See how wonderful I am. So it sort of defeats the purpose in a way. It becomes dangerous to do that. Both John and Teresa are very adamant that physical penance should be done in moderation. And Teresa very actively says, you know, living with 12 other women, it's enough mortification. You don't need to be doing much more than that. So living your life with whatever is happening in your life, it's usually plenty if you live with it with a certain perspective. And then there can be spiritual anger at not receiving consolations, and not receiving locutions, visions, other kinds of things, getting angry at others for not being as they should be, getting angry at the self, because by now I should be a saint and I'm not. So those kinds of reactions of anger because there's not enough spiritual progress or there are enough consolations. And when we talk about locutions and visions, locutions are really thoughts that occur to you. And visions are really things you may imagine or etc. And in the particular historical context, it was assumed that locutions or visions were things that were coming from God, not from our own minds. But, you know, there are thoughts that occur to us that had not occurred to us before. So something happens in prayer that lets us become aware of some things. And it's important to pay attention to that because that's the voice of God, even though we don't think it's the voice of God in any miraculous way. But we have to be careful to not be fascinated with that in such a way that it starts becoming an object of pride and or a place of avarice or land or lust. Okay. So beginners, says John, should start by, and usually start, and may have already long started, meditating, which for John and Teresa at that time, meditation is reading scripture, some good reading, and reflecting on those things. Meditation is not meditation in the sense of Buddhist meditation of breathing in silence. Meditation is consciously reflecting on scripture, on the life of Jesus, and reading, listening, attending to social justice issues, using the imagination to understand what you're doing. I'm sorry. Another thing that beginners do is just being quiet in the presence of God, as in centering prayer. But, say a number of commentators and John, this quiet, affective experience of being silent and quiet in the presence of God is not to be confused with true contemplation and union with God, regardless of what we call it. It is just a beginner's stage. It is not true contemplation and union with God. Beginners also practice external mortification, and as I said, John insists on using moderation in all these practices, and both John and Teresa talk about the trials of everyday life, depriving yourself of little things that are not absolutely necessary, learning to sacrifice some privileges, some possibilities, etc., so others can get there. Connections with other people. As I said a minute ago, Teresa says that living with 12 other women in a convent is sacrifice enough. And you don't need to go much beyond that. But, you know, the Carmelites are vegetarian and don't eat certain things and don't do certain things. So there's some sort of external mortification. According to John, we should look for things, we should seek things that are difficult, not things that are easy. We should look for what is not what we would prefer, and that's the external mortification. Again, watching not to think, oh, I'm so saintly, look at all the things I can sacrifice. I mean, that's a real danger. And looking for anything that enkindles religious fervor. So that's what beginners should do to start walking up Mount Carmel. At some point in there, after practicing these kinds of things for a while, God begins, and the metaphor John uses is that God begins to win the soul as a mother wins a child and puts it down and says, now let's walk and let's eat food rather than just suck at the breast. And that's the moment where the nights start. The night of the senses consists of an active re-education of the senses and desires. But he says, John says, that not every desire is an obstacle to growth. That desires for God and certain kinds of spiritual desires are really growth producing. But again, that's why it's important to have a good director to be able to be seeing what is going on. It's a time of purification of attachments and desire to imitate Christ. And at that moment, God is placing the soul in silence. And again, it's not necessarily the silence of the 20 minutes twice a day of centering prayer. It's deeper silence in the soul. Purification of attachments refers attachments to people, attachment to things, but it also attachment to what we think it's wonderful in us. Attachment even to what we think we have to offer. It's not denying that those things are there. It's realizing that those things could be taken away tomorrow. That these things, true humility is accepting that you may have this talent or this ability or this capacity of whatever it may be. And those things are gifts from God to be put to that service. And understanding that you could lose them any day, that they're not really yours. And that, again, is part of the emptying your identity, because I have learned to see myself in a certain way. I am this person who talks to you, who teaches, who does this, who does that. And I need to remember that I could have a stroke tomorrow and that would go away. It's not really mine. It's something that has been given, that I have a duty to use, but I need to let go of those things and be with God in silence and imitate Christ. Jesus never denied that he could do healing or this or that or the other, but at the same time, it was very clear that it was the God in him, that it was a gift of God to him. So that this is hard. That's why the nights are hard, because it's a lot easier to let go of things or people or activities that may not be so good for us. It's a lot easier to not become attached to the good parts of us, recognizing that that is not ours either. So what are the signs that a beginner is now entering into the dark night? First, the person ceases to find consolations in creatures or in God, says John. Nothing really gives you pleasure. That's why it's so easily confused with depression. It's not depression, but it's easily confused. At the same time, the person is very pained for the lack of service to God. It's like, I wanted to go to God, but God, I'm so useless. I'm so unable to really do what I want to do. I'm so incapable. This sense of frustration with yourself. And third, can no longer meditate or use their imagination for discursive meditation. Can no longer spend hours reading pieces of scripture and getting great inspiration from doing that. It becomes boring, uninteresting. You don't want to do that. And at the same time, you're feeling bad that you really cannot do your prayer, that you really cannot concentrate, that you really cannot do what you thought was the most important for you in life. That's why it feels similar to some things that are like depression or like other kinds of things, but the cause is actually very different. It's not a psychological conflict of any sort. So they should stop, these people, stop efforts at discursive meditation, at reading things, thinking about things, etc., and focus their desires on God alone and surrender to God's purifying activity in prayer by letting God take control. And again, this is very difficult. I know better than God what is good for me. And I can advise God any day about the graces I need to receive so I can get where I want to go. I mean, that's very easy. So it's very hard to say, I have no idea where I'm going. As Thomas Merton says in his famous prayer, I will trust you always, though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death. Because the fact that I think I'm doing God's will doesn't mean that I'm doing it. So it's that kind of, how do I let go? And, I'm talking to you about this. I'm not pretending that I know how to do it. I'm just saying, this is what John says that we are supposed to get to. The night of the spirit that follows the night of the senses is a harrowing experience and can last for several years. But between the night of senses and the night of spirit, we are in a state of proficience. There can be a sense of, oh my God, look what I have gone through. and now I'm really going in the right direction, and this is really what God wants from me. So there's a period of tranquility in between, sort of a plateau in between the two nights. But the night of spirit, it's a lot harder, a lot more difficult, a lot more painful, and can last for several years, because we know that human transformation is very slow. It's like watching grass grow. So what we can do is an effort to purify our spiritual faculties, the understanding intellect, the memory, and the will, as John keeps talking about. But we have to surrender and let God do the rest. And one of the things, or the way in which we have to work, is letting faith take hold and guide our intellect. One of the commentators of John says that primitives carve their gods from wood or stone, but we carve our gods from ideas, theories, and information. And we need to learn to just walk in the dark night of faith. We need to let hope, real hope, work in the memory, and know that we do not reach union with God by accumulating individual or collective memories of past experiences and consolations. To let go of our memories of who we are, what we have done, the good things that have happened to us, even the good things that have happened to us in relation to God, and open ourselves to the new, it's extremely difficult. One of the articles that you'll see a little bibliographic resources list that it's at the bottom of this PowerPoint, and that you're going to get, is an article by Constance Fitzgerald about emptying the memory, which is probably the hardest of the three things you have to clear. And then we have to let charity in the will, love in the will. We need to learn to direct all our passions to God. And this increased love for God in the night of spirit intensifies the pain of the person, because they feel powerless to pursue and encounter the God they love and desire. And again, I can claim that I fully understand this, but this is the basic. I may understand it with my intellect. I still need to understand it with my life. And that may be true for most of us. But we need to go through this spiritual purification in order to get to true contemplation. So when people are in the night of the spirit, John says, they should even forget the practice of loving attentiveness and strive to be detached of all satisfaction, including spiritual satisfaction. And again, I mean, it's difficult to conceptualize, let alone to really live through this. So we need to withdraw from many things and seek solitude. And again, remember that John was practicing withdrawal and solitude when he was walking on dusty roads or when he was putting bricks on top of one on top of another to construct something, etc. So it is possible to be in internal withdrawal and solitude, regardless of what you're doing. Then you have to practice peaceful loving, try to be tranquil, mild, tender, not only with others, but also with yourself. To be tender with ourselves. Sometimes it's more difficult than to be tender with others. Then, of course, silence, silence, silence. Stay in silence as much as possible, which includes turning off the television, turning radio music off, computer, and turning off our thoughts, because we can have our mouths shut, but be having a lot of chit chat in our brains. And again, requires practice, and it's not easy. And then again, good spiritual direction. He keeps going back to that. So let me now, rather than do this, let's just go to a little break with a little music from Linda for about 10 minutes, 7, and we'll be back here at 11. Okay. Linda? Okay, let's come back. From wherever you have been. Let's get back here. Okay, so in the middle of all this, we have to remember that the goal of this spiritual journey, it's union with God. A union that causes the transformation of one's entire personality. This is a quote from Leonard Duhan, who has a very useful little book about the challenge of John of the Cross for contemporary people. It's one of some of the drawings, the diagrams that I showed you before coming from that book. It's a very short book, but very useful and good. Okay. So the goal of the spiritual journey is union with God, a union that causes the transformation of one's entire personality. And of course, I mean, part of this is, do I really want union with God? Do I want it enough that I'm willing to go through the nights? And it's very easy to say yes, but it's a little bit more difficult, or a lot more difficult, to really engage in this journey of deep transformation. Even in John's time, this was not just something for nuns and friars. This was something for the lay people he directed, for these women, for these men, so it was something, it's something that you really have to want. And it's easier said than done. Okay, this is a transformation that unites the soul to God and God to the soul. This is a spiritual marriage. Remember that all of John's poetry is very erotic. It's about being really in love with God. And it's a God you don't see. It's a God you don't have 100% confirmation that it's there. And what is God anyway? Our understandings of God, obviously, are not the ones that people had in the 16th century. So it is all very confusing. And yet, there's a yearning in the soul that feels that this is where I have to go. This is what would make me a full person. So I really want to take this risk, even though it's scary and painful and hard, and I don't even know what the heck I'm doing. So the nada, the nothing of the nights, of the silence, of the detachment, of the depriving yourself even of attachment to spiritual things, etc., leads to self-fulfillment. And it leads to the todo, to everything, to God and everything. And in fact, you know, the journey of faith is to believe that this is true and possible, regardless of how hard. Okay. So one premise of all this is that we cannot know God if we do not know ourselves. And knowledge of God increases our self-knowledge. Like when we speak a different language, we begin to perceive a different world, as philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein said. Well, those of us who speak a different language know that we have access to different worlds. When we know God, we have access to a different language. And that language of God increases our own self-knowledge. We develop a new relational identity where God is us and we are God. And this is something that John says and something that Teresa says and any mystic would say. This deep connection with God makes me be something different. I have a relational identity. God is part of my identity. And God is us, and we are God. And one of the metaphors John uses is the metaphor of the burning log that is on fire. So let me read this long quote from John himself. Fire, when applied to wood, first dehumidifies it, dispelling all moisture and making it give off any water it contains. Then it gradually turns the wood black, makes it dark and ugly, and even causes it to emit a bad odor. But drying out the wood, the fire brings to light and expels all those ugly and dark accidents that are contrary to fire. Finally, by heating and enkindling it from without, the fire transforms the wood into itself and make it as beautiful as it is itself. So the fire, God, makes the wood into itself. Once transformed, the wood once transformed, the wood no longer has any activity or passivity of its own, except for its weight and its quantity, that it's denser than the fire. It possesses the properties and performs the actions of fire. It is dry and it dries. It is hot and it gives off heat. It is brilliant and it illumines. It is also lighter in weight than before. It is the fire that produces all these properties in the wood and transforms the wood into fire. Okay, this is a painting. It's actually a modern painting by Sigurd Cutter, who has very interesting modern sort of spiritual kind of paintings. And if you see, there's the soul, there's the person looking at itself, at its own mirror image in the bottom of this well. And in this well, you can see the person and you can see the face of Jesus also. So when you are really united, when you look at yourself, these two beings, so to speak, are united in the center. I love this picture. I find it very, very moving. And it also makes the point. Okay, so one of the things John is very insistent about It's about the importance of spiritual direction. And he actually, in the middle of his commentary on the living flame of love, he spends about 11 pages or more talking about the importance of spiritual direction and sort of telling spiritual directors, look at what you're doing and be careful with what you're doing, because you can produce a lot of damage. And of course, when he talks about spiritual directors, he's talking about, at that time, priests who were confessors, who were highly educated, and so had, in many cases, a high opinion of themselves. Now we have all sorts of spiritual directors, including lay women and etc., but that was what was there. So let me just read you a few quotes of what he's saying. Okay. Scarcely any spiritual director will be found who does not cause ill in souls God is beginning to recollect in this manner of contemplation. Not understanding the stages of prayer or the ways of the Spirit, these directors are not aware of those acts they say the soul should make, and the discursive reflection they wanted to practice have already been accomplished. In contemplation, the activity of the senses and of discursive reflection terminates. Since these spiritual masters do not understand recollection and spiritual solitude or its properties, in which solitude God applies these sublime unctions to the soul, they superpose or interpose lower spiritual exercises, and by the activity of their natural operations, they make individuals lose inner solitude and recollection, and consequently, the sublime image that God is paying within them. These directors should reflect that they themselves are not the chief agent, guide, and mover of souls, but the principal guide of the Holy Spirit. The whole concern of directors should not be to accommodate souls to their own method and condition, but they should observe the road along which God is leading one. If they do not recognize it, they should leave the soul alone and not bother it. Even though the soul is not doing anything, God is doing something in it. If you, director, will prepare the edifice of each soul, it is your duty to prepare your soul, and it's God to direct its paths. It's God's office, to direct its paths. Do not say, therefore, the soul does not advance because it's not doing anything, or it doesn't understand anything in particular, thus it will be unable to make progress. Quite the contrary. It would have particular knowledge and, very important, God does not fit in an occupied heart. Rather than by understanding, the soul advances by not understanding. Or a director can think that when the intellect does not understand particular things, the will is idle and does not love. because you believe that the will can only love what the intellect understands. But in contemplation, by which God infuses himself into the soul, particular knowledge as well as particular acts are unnecessary. Loving is supernatural knowledge. Sometimes more knowledge is experienced than God, at other times more love, not knowledge. Likewise, at all times, knowledge is felt without love, or love without knowledge. To journey to God, the will must walk in detachment from every pleasant thing. And when a director does not know what spirit is, they do a great injury to God and show disrespect towards God by intruding with a rough hand where God is working. Granted that you may possess the requisites for the full direction of some soul, but it may be impossible for you to have the qualities demanded for the guidance of all those you refuse to allow out of your hands. God leads each one along different paths, so hardly one spirit will be found like another in even half its methods or procedure. Do not tyrannize souls and deprive them of their freedom, and judge for yourself the breadth of the evangelical doctrine in this person. You may endeavor to hold on to your penitence, and you treat the penitent with a very jealous quarrelsomeness. And this is not jealousy for the glory of God, but a jealousy motivated by your pride and presumption. God becomes extremely indignant with such directors. And on for a few more pages. And basically what he's saying, if a director does not understand what God is doing, at least you have the wisdom of stay aside. And that's hard because, you're supposed to guide the soul and you don't understand what's going on in it. So it's very hard for the spiritual director. And of course, again, John is talking about men who thought they knew what they were supposed to do. And Teresa talks extensively about the damage that spiritual directors who did not understand what was happening to her in prayer did to her. And John, although he himself is a director, if we read his letters of spiritual direction, we realize that he's very gentle and waits for God to take the lead rather than telling people where they're supposed to go. Okay. Finally, let me say that although we have been talking about personal spiritual transformation, about the personal union, direct union with God, which is mysticism, being united with God, always has social implications. It is not, we're not floating on air, detached from everything that is happening. Neither John nor Teresa nor any of the real mystics do that, but it's important for us to remember this. John was writing about this, about these things, about the experiences of being deeply in touch with God, while he was helping to build walls, dig ditches, and cultivate fields. So very practically. He was writing for nuns and men, lay women and men, believing anyone, including illiterate lay women or men, could reach the highest forms of union with God. This was not something reserved for privileged, educated men. And in fact, some of those privileged, educated men were so caught in what they thought they knew that they did not open themselves to God, and God forbid, sometimes interfered with other people doing that. Mystics are always acting in the world. Probably the closest example we have is Thomas Merton, who was so concerned what was happening in the world around him, even though he was living alone in the hermitage, even away from other monks in the monastery. So in the middle of the silence and solitude, he was concerned with what was happening in the world. And there are others. There's a very moving book by German theologian Dorothea Sohle, in which the title of the book is The Silent Cry, in which he talks about mysticism and social action, and etc. So all those things are there. I mean, the concern with the world and with social justice is very present. Before we go to questions, let me just briefly go with my, I lost my, oh, here it is. Okay. Before we do that, let's read the loving flame of God. I sort of skipped this when the PowerPoint got stuck. Okay. So this is the last big poem John wrote, and it's not because the poem is big, but because it's recognized as one of his best poems. And again, it's about reaching intimate communication with God. So this he titled Songs of the Soul in the Intimate Communication of Loving Union with God. And the title used is the first line of the poem, but what he said was, these were the sons of the soul in the intimate communication of loving union with God. So, oh llama de amor viva, que tiernamente hieres de mi alma el más profundo centro, pues ya no eres esquiva, acaba ya si quieres, rompe la tela de este dulce encuentro. Oh cautiverio suave, oh regalada llaga, oh mano blanda, oh toque delicado que a vida eterna sabe y toda deuda paga. Matando muerte en vida la has trocado. Oh lámparas de fuego, en cuyos resplandores las profundas cavernas del sentido que estaba oscuro y ciego, con extraños primores, calor y luz, dan junto a su querido. Cuán manso y amoroso recuerdas en mi seno, donde secretamente solo moras, y en tu aspirar sabroso de bien y gloria lleno, cuán delicadamente me enamoras. O living flame of love, that tenderly wounds my soul in its deepest center. Since now you're not oppressive, now consummate, if it be your will, tear down the veil of this sweet encounter. O sweet cautery, O delightful wound, O gentle hand, O delicate touch, that taste of eternal life and pays every debt. In killing, you change death to life. O lamps of fire, in whose splendor the deep caverns of feeling, once obscure and blind, now give forth so rarely, so exquisitely, both warm and light to their beloved. How gently and lovingly you wait in my heart, where in secret you will alone, and in your sweet breathing, filled with glory and good, how tenderly you seduce me with love. The English translation says, swell my heart with love, but enamorar in Spanish it's seduced, and not necessarily in a sexual seduce, but certainly in an erotic way. So I'm saying, how tenderly you seduce me with love, as opposed to swell my heart. So again, oh llama de amor vivo que tiernamente hieres de mi alma el más profundo centro, pues ya no eres esquiva, acaba ya si quieres, rompe la tela de este dulce encuentro. Oh cautiverio suave, oh regalada llaga, oh mano blanda, oh toque delicado que a vida eterna sabe que toda deuda paga, matando muerte en vida la has trocado. O lámpara de fuego en cuyos resplandores las profundas cavernas del sentido que estaba oscuro y ciego, con extraños primores, calor y luz, dan junto a su querido. Cuán manso y amoroso recuerdas en mi seno, donde secretamente solo moras, y en tu aspirar sabroso de bien y gloria lleno, cuán delicadamente me enamoras. Linda. Okay, so before we go to the questions, let me go a little through some of these bibliographic resources. The best, most accepted, most authorized English translation of the collected works of John of the Cross is the translation by Kieran Kavanagh and Otilio Rodriguez. It's the one that all the commentators cite, and it's the one I've been reading from when I read directly from John. There are some recent translations that sort of distort a little what John is saying. And there's some older translation of the complete works by Alison Pierce, which is still good, but Kavanagh and Rodriguez really get to the substance of John much clearer, even though some of the translations are not absolutely perfect. Then in Spanish, for those who read Spanish, there's obras completas, and there are a gazillion versions of John's obras completas. There are a few I like. One is the one from Editorial Monte Carmelo, the other is from the Biblioteca de Autores Cristianos, and the other one is from Editorial Planeta. And the commentary, the person who sort of tells us this is what is going on here, are these three people for each one of them. I just discovered a very inexpensive, it was like $198 or one something, a Kindle edition in Spanish. I got it for my Kindle, but I haven't read it yet, so I suppose it's okay. And it includes in this thing one of the earliest biographies of John. There's a biography of John that I like a lot, John the Crossman and Mystic, from Pauline Books and Media, that was originally published as Search for Nothing. It's from Richard Hardy. It's a very nice little biography, although sometimes it's a little bit too sweet. But, you know, it's good. And Richard Hardy is a spiritual, he's a layman, but he's a spiritual director and lecturer and retreat master. And I actually, many years ago, took some courses with him about Teresa and John. So then there are other works about John of the Cross. In some cases, they may be special issues of Carmelites writing different things. And as in this one, for example, from Kevin Colligan and Regis Jordan, Carmelite Contemplation, which is Carmelite Studies number 8 from the Washington Institute for Carmelite Studies, which has lots of things about Carmelites. There are articles here in this issue by Bernard McGinn, Kevin Colligan, and Constance Fitzgerald, and others, specifically about John. There are other things, but these two write about it. There's A Better Wine, which are a series of essays celebrating Kieran Gavano, who was the translator of John, again by Institute of Carmelite Stories. And there are articles by Colligan, Mark Foley, William Johnston, and others. And by the way, Kevin Colligan and Mark Foley are both psychologists. So sometimes you get some sort of modern psychological insights from them. Leonard Duhan, The Contemporary Challenge of John of the Cross, it's the one that I said earlier that has some very interesting things that are worth taking a look at. There's Fire Within, Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross on prayer. It's a fairly old book, but it has some interesting things. Keith Egan has something on Carmelite prayer where there are articles about John. And then there are 3 articles of by Constance Fitzgerald that are very good at helping us understand these in a more dedicated. Constance Fitzgerald is a Carmelite nun in the Baltimore Carmel and has written a bunch of things, but these 3 are specifically about John, and you can find all 3 on the internet. Then Mark Foley, who I mentioned a minute ago, has something on the Dark Knight that is pretty good, updated. Edward Howells has John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, Mystical Knowledge and Selfhood. And William Menninger has John of the Cross from the for beginners. And it's pretty good at summarizing all the chapters of Ascent to Mount Carmel and Dark Night. He thinks that neither the spiritual canticle nor the flame are for beginners. I think that, as I said last time, when you know what the goal is, it's easier to go through the trial along the way. But okay. Then Steve Payne, in 2011, wrote on the Carmelite tradition, and this it's an interesting description of the progress of Carmelite tradition from back in the caves of Mount Carmel during the Crusades to our day now. So it's an interesting overview of that. Then there's, in Spanish, from Patricio Peñalver, La Mística Española, siglos XVI y XVII. It's an overview of Spanish mysticism, which flourished during the 16th and 17th century. So it's sort of later than the Northern European mystics, and it has its very unique characteristics, particularly the emphasis on the erotic and the spiritual marriage. And it has a long chapter on John of the Cross. It talks about Teresa and about others, but it has a long chapter on John of the Cross that is very good. Wayne Simsick, it's part of a collection of praying with that St. Mary's Press has produced through the years. Praying with is saying that, saying the other, and sometimes not saints, but important figures. And this praying with John of the Cross is pretty good. It's very short exercises of prayer around the processes that John is talking about. And then finally, Edith Stein, Saint Edith Stein, wrote The Science of the Cross, which is part of the collected works of Edith Stein that the Institute of Carmelite Studies has produced. In Spanish, there's an edition that is called, entitled Ciencia de la Cruz, that actually came out considerably earlier, about 10 years earlier than the one in English. Both are translations of the original German, and the Spanish translation is earlier because there was interest in Spain about whatever Edith Stein was saying about John of the Cross before it became, I mean, here in the States, there was interest in other aspects of Edith Stein's work. And there's like 6 or 7 volumes of her work. Stein's religious name was Teresa Benedicta de la Cruz, Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. So at some point, she was asked to write about John of the Cross for the 4th centennial of his birth in 1942. If you know anything about Edith Stein, she was actually murdered in Auschwitz in 1942. So she was still writing this on the day she was arrested. And for this reason, the book ends very abruptly with the death of John without any final commentaries. And just as a commentary, when I was doing research on Edith Stein, I had that piece of paper in my hand, encased in plastic, because they're afraid that anyone can touch it. But it was the last page that Edith Stein wrote. And it was very moving to see her handwriting speaking about John of the Cross. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and we are going to go back to the questions with Corey is going to moderate, and I'll do my best to answer them. So here we are.
Thank you, Oliva, once again for a fabulous presentation. So our first question is, if the difficulties of life are not to be confused with the dark night, how might we compare? Are difficulties parallel? Are they the precursor to the dark night? Can they lead us to the dark night? Are difficulties and despair sometimes related and sometimes not?
Okay, well, we all suffer from human difficulties. Even people who are not striving to get to God, people who are not striving to, you know, this union that we are talking about, it's the human condition. We all suffer. And when we're suffering, yes, pray. Yes, you know, ask God for what you need. Use those to make them be a better person. When we suffer, you know, it is possible to, on the one hand, when humans are presented with suffering, and suffering is unavoidable, it's part of the human condition. There's the possibility of hardening and becoming cruel. And there's the possibility of softening and opening up. So in the face of human suffering, trying to open up to become a better person. There's years ago, I read a story about this, and there were two guys. Their parents were immigrants and had been very mistreated by whoever. And one of them decided, I am going to become very rich so nobody does this to me. And the other one decided, I am going to become a lawyer so I defend immigrants against injustice. And the experience was this experience of their parents, but there's a different way of reacting to it. And that's sort of a concrete illustration of what happens when we are confronted with suffering. Now, that suffering in itself is not going to create union with God. It's a step in our journey, and we can work through that and soften, become tender and mild, as John says, and keep opening up with God in the silence. I don't know if that answers the question.
And so another question is, in John's writings, what is the difference between la persona and el alma?
None. He uses the soul, el alma, as a definition of the person. And he's not seeing the soul and the flesh as two separate things. The soul is the person. So there's really no difference.
We have another one as to where the manuscripts of Edith Stein's writings are held.
In Cologne, Germany, in the Carmelite convent in Cologne. And the person who was the curator at that time in the 90s when I was there was Mother Amata Meyer. She's now dead, and I don't know who's the person who's in charge of the manuscript at this point.
So we had a question of what is the Vatican's relationship with mystics in the Roman Catholic Church? And Cheryl goes on to ask, at least historically, mystics have sometimes been repressed or their teachings have been repressed by the authorities. And why, if any, are mystics threatening to religious elites in the Roman Catholic Church?
Okay, I'll start with that last part.
Okay.
Why are they threatening to authority? Because if you are in direct contact with God, if you have a deep relationship with God, and you are being transformed in God, and you and God have an intimate relationship, you really don't have much use for some priest telling you what you're supposed to be doing, because you have it directly from the boss. So in Teresa's and John's time, with the Inquisition, it was very clear that the church and the state were not going to give anyone a chance to think for themselves. And that's where there was a lot of persecution. We won't have the same thing now, because now the church doesn't have any authority to make us be put on the scaffolding and set to fire. Luckily, that's not happening, but there are many ways of doing that. And, orders of silencing some theologians, silencing some mystics. Anybody who's not compliant with the hierarchy authority runs the danger of being punished, because those in authority don't like to have their authority and their power challenged. And that's the reason why so many mystics through the centuries were persecuted and mistreated, and sometimes even executed, and etc., because of that need to, keep control over what people were thinking and doing, so they could keep control over people.
And a follow-up to that is whether you would consider Jesus a mystic in that sense.
Well, I suppose yes, but that's a very complicated answer because it goes in theological disquisitions about who Jesus was, and I'm not qualified to do that. All I can say is that the early councils of the church said that Jesus was 100% human and 100% God, not 50% human and 50% God. Okay, so what that means and how to understand it and etc. I'm not a theologian, so I don't want to get into that territory because I don't know what I'm doing.
All right. I think those are all the questions that we'd had typed up, but we now have allowed people to unmute themselves. So if you'd like to ask a question of Oliva, now is your chance.
Okay.
Hi, Oliva.
Hi, Cheryl.
Sorry I was a little late today, but I have a question, and it deals with the mystics. Is there a good recommended, maybe it's in your bibliography, but I didn't look yet, a very good recommended book or peer-reviewed article on that history of the mystics being persecuted by the Roman Catholic Church in terms of the authorities and why they've been fearing the mystics and their teachings?
Okay, no, it's not in the bibliography because I'm keeping the bibliography to John of the Cross. And even then, it's very limited. There are hundreds of things on John of the Cross. In terms of history, Grace Jensen, Jentzen, has something about mysticism and gender that is very good. So, I mean, there's a question coming in about will you get the bibliography? Yes, you will. Okay, so that, I mean, I like Jensen's, but there are other things. There are things about mystics and social justice. There's the silent cry that I mentioned before, although that's not about what happened so much to mystics in the past, although she does talk about Lutheran mystics. Dorothea Soul, because she's Lutheran, so she talks about Lutheran mystics, some of whom were persecuted. So those are the two things I can think of from the top of my head: the mysticism and social justice. No, Dorothy Sole. It's SOELLE. Exactly, that's it. Corey just put it in. And there are two dots on the little O, or two little dots on the O. So.
Okay. I have a question. Can you talk about, not a question, can you talk about how Teresa and John of the Cross were sometimes by the Inquisition, they were attacked, thinking that their teaching was...
John was not persecuted by the Inquisition. There were no inquiries about him. He was persecuted by other Carmelites, both as initially when they were separating between the Cals and Discals. This is what I talked about last time. But also even by the Discals Carmelites, who were jealous of him at the end of his life, and they were fairly unfair to him. However, like anybody in Spain at that time, he was very careful about what he was saying in terms of what the Inquisition could do if they reacted to what he was saying. So he was very bright and very careful, and he had very serious theological training. So he could translate his teaching. I mean, if you read what he is very, you know, very 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He's very good about this kind of thing. And Teresa was different because Teresa, number one, was a woman. And number two, everybody knew that her, I don't know if everybody, but most people knew that her grandfather was a converso Jew. And those two conditions were not particularly good at that time in Spain. And so her first book, which was the story of her life, where she says she wrote because her confessor asked her to write that, is this is what happened to me. These are the graces that God gave to me. And that book, although it was looked at by the Inquisition, or one of the inquisitors, a censor, I should say, by one of the censors, who wrote a long note at the bottom saying that there was nothing in there that was not Orthodox Catholic doctrine. However, it was a book that it was better kept away from people who were not educated enough to understand this. So only educated men should read what Teresa was writing. And so the Inquisition grabbed the book and never gave it back to her. She never again saw it. So then at the later stages of her life, one of the superiors say, write what your experience is, but write it in third person. So that's when the interior castle happened. And the interior castle, actually, she goes deeper because she had developed more spiritually and increased her union with God by the time she wrote it than what she had 15 years earlier when she wrote her life. So there's a greater depth in what she writes. And in the interior castle, she's talking as if it was just a process. And every so often she says, I know a person who, and we know she's talking about herself, but at no point she says, this is me. And that, of course, helps avoid that. In addition to the Inquisition keeping her book, there were a couple of complications in some convents in Andalusia where there was particularly one nun who was fairly emotionally disturbed. And it's interesting because Teresa talks about her in the kindest possible way and at no point tells this woman accused me to the Inquisition. But okay, so this woman said that there were wrong things happening with in Teresa's convents, and that also attracted an investigation from the Inquisition. And the couple of times they looked at her, they ended up saying there's nothing wrong here, but that she was subjected to the investigation, while John was never subjected to investigation by the Inquisition. There were, at the end of John's life, another of the Discalced Carmelites, his name was Diego Evangelista, who was very insistent that, John probably was doing something wrong with his directees because they like him too much. And one of the things the directees did was burn his letters to not put him in a difficult position. So there are very few letters. There are only like 30 letters that have been preserved. And in one case, the day he was apprehended by the Carmelites, when they were coming in and he could hear the noise that they were coming in, he literally ate some of the letters he had received from his directees so they would not get in trouble with the Inquisition. Okay. I suppose that answers the question. I hope that answers.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful.
Okay. Any other questions? We have about 5 more minutes.
Oliva, this is Jane.
Uh-huh.
And I was wondering if, in your opinion, there are key theological or spiritual differences between the thought of John the Cross and Teresa of Avila, or if, in your opinion, they're an essential agreement. It's just that they teach, and to some extent,
they are
different.
in essential agreement. It's just that Teresa is talking like someone who's not theologically trained, and she wrote some poetry, but the quality of John's poetry, as I said before, is like the best poetry in Spanish language, pretty much. And he was a poet, not an extraordinary poet like he was. So he used poetry to teach, and he used his organized theological knowledge to teach. And she uses her own experience in her life, and they have very different styles. He's all exuberant, loving, and passionate when he's writing poetry, but when he's writing his treatises, he's like, you know, a very organized, scholastic way of thinking and putting things together. Teresa is all over the place. She's talking about how she feels and what she thinks, and that is part because of who she was. That is part because she's trying to say, oh, I'm a poor little ignorant woman, don't mind me. Let me say this. So that is, you know, they have very different styles, but they're actually talking about the same thing. John talks about the nights as a description of what is happening. Teresa might say, we have to clear the sabandijas, which is like the insects and, you know, whoever, lizards that get into our soul. And we have to get rid of those things. And in doing that, it hurts our soul. She's talking about the night without using the word. So, and then at the end, they both talking about this union with God in which you're one. And in the 7th mansion, Teresa talks about not having any extraordinary experiences. She's just there with a constant internal silence, knowing that the Trinity is living in her while she's doing all her business of founding convents and doing other things. And John, at the end, is talking about we are one, we're married, and this is it. So it's different wording and different ways of getting there. But I mean, in reality, the mystical process of growth is the same, not only for Catholics, it's for, you know, Buddhists and Hindus and whoever is trying to get there. And what happens is that we each take the tools our culture is giving us, our system of belief to explain what is happening in us. So a Buddhist would give different explanations about the 8 truths and the 4 ways and the whatever. I don't know much about Buddhism, but, you know, would do it in that way. And a Christian would say Jesus, but they're talking about union with a reality that goes beyond us and that we desire and are in love with and want to get there regardless of how difficult the road is. So all of them have the same. And I mean, the idea of mortification, like fasting or penances or whatever, it's not only Christian. I mean, the natives of North America did it. And, you know, so it's something that it's there, so.
Oh.
Yes, Mara.
Yes. So when can we be with you again?
I don't know. You'll have to ask Corey. She's the boss here. And Diane, who also did a lot of work to put this thing
Thank
together.
you so much, all of you. Thank you.
Corey,
we
could you
need to have more questions and more answer with you, Oliva, next time.
Okay. Could you somehow save the chat and,
Oh, yeah.
and send it to me, because I wasn't able to look at the questions while I was answering them. And I know that
Yes.
once we turn off, the chat would disappear. So if you could please do
Yes,
that. Okay.
I will do that.
Anything else?
So I have one, Oliva, to sort of wrap
Uh-huh.
us up with. So last week, you at the closing of last week's session, you invited folks to listen for how God is speaking to them in their life and how John is speaking to them in their life. And so I'm wondering, with this week focusing more on the Dark Night poetry, what would you want to leave us with to ponder as we go forward?
Again, emphasize the need to be in silence with God, and acknowledging that you don't know what the heck you're doing, but you do want this. You do want to reach God. You do want to be with God, and you don't know how to do it. But here I am, present, and you do what I need to do, which I don't know what it is. And that's all we can really do.
Thank you.
And I don't do it for more than 5 minutes at a time, I have to say. But, that's it.
Well, once again, thank you, Oliva, for all of your hard work. I know we've all enjoyed these sessions quite a bit. So we're grateful for you sharing your wisdom and your spirituality with all of us. For everyone who's joined us, thank you for joining us, for giving us this time out of your Saturdays. We know that you have many Zoom options to choose from during this pandemic, and we're grateful that you chose to spend some time with us. And Linda, I see you have your harp ready, and I'm wondering if you could play us out a little bit.
Yes. Before that starts, let me say, remember to give a little donation to Mary Magdalene.
Yeah.
And also, if you want something, just put it in, ask for it, and we'll see what we can do.
And we did drop those links in the chat. So mmacc.org/donate is where you can support us, and pastor@mmacc.org. You can email me with any suggestions you have. All right, Linda,
Okay.
if you would.
Thank you to all of you for being here.
Thank you.
Okay.
And Corey.
Linda, and let's be in silence with God as we each say goodbye. Go ahead.
Again, thank you all for joining us.
Thanks.
And go in peace.